We started with Unit 1 of this course, Rural Society in India, Historical Understanding and Perspectives. In the previous lesson, we covered the first part of this unit, which is introducing and defining what a village means in the Indian context. Now this lesson is going to be the second part of this unit, which is a historical understanding and nationalist perspectives of village India. Before I start this lesson, let me have a quick recap of the first lesson, which is on understanding and defining a village. We started understanding the concept of a revenue village, which is the most basic administrative unit and is defined by the Census of India as an area or habitation which has a distinct survey boundary. A revenue village can consist of more than one hamlets, and the Census of India also defines a rural area as all the area that does not come under the purview of an urban area. We then moved on to look at various terms that have been used for village. For instance, gram, which refers to an area of cultivable land and the people who cultivate the land. We also learnt of the Latin term vicus, from which the term village is derived. There are also other terms that I use: rural, countryside, folk, peasant society. All of these are synonymous to a village. We then moved on to understand differences between rural and urban areas. We then moved on to understand that villages are not homogeneous. There are differences that exist across villages, and these are determined by the types of settlement, these are determined by the social condition of the village, by the economic condition of the village, the distance the distance at which the village is located from the city. We also understood that the term rural is used in contrast to the term urban, and there are several differences that exist between rural and urban areas in terms of occupation, where a rural area is seen with agriculture as the primary occupation when compared to urban areas which have services as the primary occupation. Secondly, we looked at social interaction in a village where being a small unit, everyone is familiar with the other person, which may not be the case in an urban area. Thirdly, we also looked at the diversity of population in a village where you will have fewer number of varied communities, whereas in an urban area you will find people from various castes, various states, various languages who come and interact with each other. And lastly, we also spoke about the rural-urban continuum, where the transformation from a rural to urban area happens gradually, where the transformation from a rural to an urban area happens gradually, where we see rural at the one end of the spectrum and urban at the other end of the spectrum. Now with this recap, I am going to move on to the second lesson, and in this lesson we are going to try and understand how the idea of village as a little republic has been articulated historically, and secondly we will also understand the trajectory of village becoming an important unit for development planning in India. In order to do this, the way I have structured the lesson is broadly into two periods. We will understand the articulation of the idea of village during the British period, wherein we will talk of the views of Sir Charles Metcalfe and Henry S. Maine. Then we will move on to discuss the views and perspective of nationalist leaders Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar. And from there we will then talk about the idea of village getting further reinforced in post-independence period. And from there we will then talk about the idea of the village as a microcosm getting reinforced in the post-independence period. Let us now begin with the British period. The settlement of land revenue was a major administrative act of the British government. Though the village had been a basic unit of agrarian Indian society, but it was with the introduction of British acts of administration that an articulation was lent to the idea of Indian village. There were various studies and reports that were brought out by British administrators, and among these, the most notable studies were one by Sir Charles Metcalfe called Minutes on the Village of Delhi, which came out in 1830, and the other by Henry S. Maine, which was titled Village Communities in the East and West, which came out in 1871. Sir Charles Metcalfe, in his work, discusses the self-sufficiency of the Indian village. In fact, the notion that Indian village is isolated and self-sufficient was first propounded by him way back in 1830. And since then, there have been many other supporters, and this theory has become a kind of classic formulation. He says, the village communities are little republics, having nearly everything that they want within themselves and almost independent of any foreign relations. Further, he stated that wars pass over it, regimes come and go, but the village as a society always emerges unchanged, unshaken and self-sufficient. 40 years later, in 1871, Sir Henry Maine, in his Village Communities of the East and West, reiterated this idea of the self-sufficiency of the Indian village. He says, they, that is Indian village communities, in fact include a nearly complete establishment of occupations and trades for enabling them to continue their collective life without assistance from any person or body external to them. Karl Marx, from whom we would have thought there would be a departure from this conventional view, he also popularized this concept of village self-sufficiency. There were several economic studies that were also done around this time. To cite a few of these, E.V. Lukash in Punjab initiated intensive studies of particular villages and general agricultural problems. The Punjab Board of Economic Inquiry organized village surveys conducted by individual workers. This was in 1920s. The Bengal Board of Economic Inquiry was set up in 1935 and they conducted village surveys. And a Gandhian economist, J.C. Kumarappa, he conducted surveys in villages, and his book called The Economic Survey of Matar Taluka came out in 1931. Now, we understand from all this that village is a fundamental social unit where people living have a feeling of common identity. We also understand that there are familial ties as also caste and class links in different domains of village life, whether it is social, economic, political or cultural. But it's also important for us to understand that village life is characterized by reciprocity and cooperation on the one hand, but also by dominance and competition on the other hand. Having said all of this, the village in India has never been an isolated unit. It has been connected to the macro, to a wider region, and it has had ties beyond its boundaries. There are several other studies which have shown this, that Indian village was hardly ever isolated and that it had links with the wider society. In the nationalist imagination, for nationalist leaders, the village was central to the traditional social order of India. But there were wide variations among leaders in the perception that they carried of village. Let's have a look at some of these. We have heard the famous insight of Mahatma Gandhi, India lives in its villages. These words of Mahatma Gandhi summarize the significance that he accorded to villages in Indian society. He reinforced the village community as a self-sufficient, morally and economically integrated organic unit. He considered the village as a site of authenticity, which is real and pure, and it had to be uncorrupted by Western influence. In his perception, the new India, the new nation had to be founded in its villages, which is where the majority of population of India lived. Even after India achieved freedom from British rule, real Swaraj, he said, would actually be in restoring the autonomy and self-sufficiency of villages and village communities by actually getting rid of changes that were brought about by colonial rule. In his own words, he says, "A village unit as conceived by me is as strong as the strongest. My imaginary village consists of 1,000 souls. Such a unit can give a good account to itself if it is well organized on a basis of self-sufficiency." Mahatma Gandhi, however, was concerned about the practice of untouchability and also the lack of cleanliness in India's villages. And to this, he says that my ideal village will contain intelligent human beings. They will not live in dirt and darkness. Men and women will be free and be able to hold their own against anyone in the world. Now, unlike Mahatma Gandhi, and by contrast, Nehru did not identify with the idea of village as the site of future transformation. He considered the notion of village republics as characterized by various ills. He was critical of caste hierarchies, he did not see any virtue in reviving traditional social order, and he was skeptical of the Indian village becoming economically self-sufficient. Unlike Gandhi and Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar had had first-hand experience of village life in his childhood. He offered a radical critique of the Indian village. He characterized village republics as being nowhere near democratic, and he saw the village as a place of localism, of narrow-mindedness, which was marked by exclusion, exploitation, and untouchability. So, in all the views of the nationalist leaders, we see that though there is variation in their perspective towards village in India, nonetheless the village was recognized by each of them as a basis of Indian society, and it is this recognition which was also carried forward into the process of nation building, because in post-independence India, the projection of the village actually became a template for nation building. There were a large number of policy decisions that were directed towards the village, and there were several rural development programs that were also designed for the benefit of village India. We see that village as a microstructure became an important unit for national development planning and also for political cultural consciousness. So, government sponsored schemes of, even today we see that government sponsored schemes of development and reform are introduced with the village as a unit of administration. So, in the first lesson we started with defining village as a unit of administration, and here in this lesson we see how this conceptualization of village being a social microcosm was reinforced. Village being a self-sufficient unit, nationalist leaders also carried forward this view of village being the basis of Indian society, and how this continued into post-independence era. At the end of this lesson and in conclusion, I would like to give you a small exercise. My question to you is, what are your views on the village in India being the most fundamental unit for administration and for development planning? In this, I split into further two questions. What are the arguments that you will put in favor of it? And have you had any direct experience of a village receiving development benefits? Reflect on this, make a note of your thoughts and write a small note. With this, I will conclude the second lesson, and I will see you in the third part of the first unit. Thank you.